You find yourself standing in the shadows of a grand cathedral on a crisp morning in medieval England. The year is 1236, and sunlight streams through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across cold stone floors. The air is thick with incense and the whispered prayers of nobles gathered for what should be the most joyous day in a young woman's life. But if you look closely at the bride standing before the altar, you'll notice something that chills you to the bone. Her hands are trembling, not with excitement, but with pure terror. This is Eleanor of Provence, only 13 years old. The man beside her, King Henry III of England, is 28 and a complete stranger. She has never spoken to him before today, never seen his face until this moment when he lifts her veil. Her childhood ended the moment her father signed the marriage contract, and now she stands here, knowing that in a few hours, she will face something that fills her with more dread than any battlefield or plague, her wedding night. This isn't the sanitized fairy tale of Disney movies or romantic period dramas. This is the brutal reality of medieval royal marriage, where 13-year-old girls were sold like cattle to men old enough to be their fathers, where the most intimate moments of a woman's life became public spectacles, and where wedding nights weren't celebrations of love, but traumatic initiation rituals that could literally kill. Welcome to the true story of why medieval queens feared their wedding nights more than death itself. These aren't tales of nervous brides with cold feet. These are stories of systematic terror, of children forced into adult situations they couldn't comprehend, of young women who understood that their wedding night might be the last night they ever felt safe. A system of political transactions, not love. The first thing to understand about medieval royal marriages is that they had nothing to do with love. These weren't romantic unions between willing partners. They were business transactions, political alliances, and breeding arrangements where the bride's feelings were not just irrelevant, but actively dangerous to the families involved. Imagine being a noble daughter, perhaps 10 or 11, playing with dolls or learning to embroider, when your father summons you to his chambers. He doesn't ask for your opinion or seek your consent. He simply informs you that you've been promised to a man you've never met, in a country you've never seen, for reasons you're too young to understand. Your childhood is over, and there's nothing you can do about it. Margaret Beaufort learned this at 6 when she was betrothed to John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk. By 9, political circumstances shifted, and she was promised to Edmund Tudor instead. She had no say in either arrangement. Her value wasn't measured by her intelligence, kindness, or dreams, but by the land she would inherit, the alliances her marriage could secure, and, most importantly, the children she could produce. The psychological impact was profound. These girls grew up knowing their bodies didn't belong to them, that their futures were decided by men in distant castles, and that they would one day be handed to a stranger with absolute power over their lives. They lived in constant anxiety, never knowing when the summons would come or what kind of man they would be forced to marry. The bedding ceremony, public humiliation. The arranged marriage was just the beginning. The real horror started with the bedding ceremony, a medieval tradition so invasive it would be considered torture today. This wasn't a private moment between newlyweds. It was a public spectacle where the most intimate act of marriage became community entertainment. After the wedding feast, the bride and groom were escorted to their bedchamber by a crowd of guests' family, friends, nobles, and sometimes strangers who packed into the room, making crude jokes and offering unsolicited advice, while the terrified couple was forced to undress in front of everyone. Guests threw clothing around, commented on the bride's body, and created an atmosphere of a sexual circus, turning a private moment into a degrading performance. For royal couples, the bedding ceremony was even more invasive because these marriages were political alliances worth fortunes and kingdoms, requiring witnesses to ensure consummation. In some cases, guests remained in the room during the act itself, watching from behind curtains or standing at the foot of the bed to verify the deed was done. The bride's virginity, pain, fear, and tears became public property. Imagine being 13, terrified of the stranger you'd been forced to marry, and having dozens of adults watch as you're stripped naked and prepared for a painful, frightening experience. The psychological trauma of this ritual was devastating, yet it was considered normal, even necessary, to validate royal marriages. Witnesses weren't there out of cruelty, though the effect was cruel, but to verify the bride's declaration, preventing disputes about inheritance or legitimacy. The bride's trauma was collateral damage in a system prioritizing political stability over human dignity. Child brides and physical dangers. The most terrifying aspect wasn't the public humiliation or forced intimacy, but the age of the brides. These weren't mature women making informed decisions about their sexuality. They were children, some as young as 8, thrust into situations they couldn't understand or consent to. Isabella de Valois, the youngest queen in English history, married King Richard II at 8 years old. Try to imagine an 8-year-old today being told she marry a grown man and share his bed. It's monstrous. Yet for medieval royalty, it was standard. Eleanor of Provence was 13 when she married Henry III. Margaret of Anjou was 15 when she wed Henry VI. Anne of Bohemia was 15 when she became Richard II's first wife. These weren't exceptions, they were the norm. The political value of these girls was so high that families couldn't wait until they were emotionally or physically ready for marriage. The medical reality was horrifying. In medieval times, girls typically reached menarche around 16, not 12 or 13 as today, meaning many child brides were expected to produce heirs before their bodies were capable of pregnancy. This didn't stop their husbands from trying, often with devastating consequences. Margaret Beaufort's case illustrates the horror. At 12, she married Edmund Tudor, a man 24 years her senior. Custom dictated that child brides wait until physical maturity to consummate marriages, but Edmund, eager for her inheritance and an heir, couldn't wait. What followed was systematic rape. Edmund repeatedly assaulted his 12-year-old wife until she became pregnant. Her writings later reveal the trauma: sleepless nights, constant fear, and the helpless rage of a child trapped in an adult's nightmare. When Edmund died of plague less than a year later, he left a 13-year-old widow pregnant with his child. The birth nearly killed her. Her confessor called it a miracle that such a small person survived. The trauma was so severe that, despite 2 later marriages, Margaret never had another child, her body permanently damaged by a pregnancy it wasn't ready to handle. A lifetime of reproductive servitude. These child queens faced their wedding nights knowing they might be raped, forced to bear children before their bodies were ready, and might die in the process. Their fears were rational, rooted in the real dangers they faced. The physical trauma was only part of the horror. The psychological impact created a generation of queens living in constant fear, never knowing when their husbands might turn violent with no one to trust. They were isolated in their new courts, surrounded by strangers who viewed them as political assets. The system was designed to break these girls, transforming them from independent children into compliant wives who produced heirs without complaint. The wedding night was just the beginning of a lifetime of oppression. The morning after, A 13-year-old queen woke sore, bleeding, and psychologically shattered, only to face court physicians examining her to verify her lost virginity. Her bedsheets were inspected for blood, her body poked and prodded, and the intimate details of her trauma recorded for posterity. This was the start of a surveillance system monitoring every aspect of her reproductive life. Medieval queens were walking wombs, their value tied to producing male heirs. Court officials tracked their menstrual cycles, monitored meals for pregnancy signs, and invaded every moment of privacy with servants reporting on fertility. Failure to conceive within the first year brought accusations of barrenness, divine punishment, or infidelity, risking annulment, exile, or death. Margaret of Anjou, married to Henry VI at 15, endured 8 years of marriage before producing an heir, facing monthly disappointments, invasive examinations, and whispered speculations of being cursed or defective. When she finally gave birth to Edward of Westminster, she wept not from joy, but from relief at fulfilling the purpose for which she had been sold. Childbirth was a death sentence many didn't survive, with royal physicians prioritizing the baby over the mother. Eleanor of Provence, who trembled at her altar, gave birth at 16 after a 3-day labor that nearly killed her. Within months, she was pregnant again, the political need for multiple heirs outweighing her physical recovery. She bore 5 children, each birth a potential death sentence faced with stoic resignation. Isolation and psychological collapse. The psychological toll of reproductive servitude was crushing. Queens lived in fear of pregnancy, knowing each conception might be their last. They resorted to superstitions, praying to saints, carrying amulets, or enduring harmful medical treatments. Attempts at birth control were treasonous, risking imprisonment or execution. The isolation was profound. Sent to foreign courts, they knew no one, spoke different languages, and had no allies. Isabella de Valois, sent from France to England at 8, was surrounded by English courtiers who viewed her as a political curiosity. Scolded for maintaining French customs, her identity was stripped away, replaced by what the English court deemed appropriate. Correspondence from these queens reveals their despair, homesickness so intense it caused physical illness, nightmares that made sleep terrifying, and a constant sense of being watched. Their letters home contained coded pleas for rescue and expressions of regret. Many developed severe mental health issues, becoming withdrawn, paranoid, or religiously extreme. Some turned manipulative, wielding what little power they had. The most tragic stopped eating, speaking, or moving, their minds broken by trauma. These weren't dramatic gestures, but the collapse of young women who had endured too much. A legacy of courage amid horror. The fears of medieval queens weren't about one night of terror, but the realization that their wedding night marked the start of a life without control over their bodies, choices, or destiny. The true horror was what came after, a lifetime where every dawn brought new reasons to fear. They faced their wedding nights with the courage of soldiers, knowing they might not survive, and even if they did, they would never be the same. Their fears were the rational terror of children sacrificed to political necessity. When you see a medieval wedding in movies, remember Eleanor of Provence trembling at her altar, demands that you recall Margaret Beaufort's traumatic childbirth, and Isabella de Valois crying in a language no one understood. Behind every crown was a frightened child valued only for what her body could produce. These queens deserve to be remembered, not as historical footnotes, but as human beings who endured unimaginable trauma with a strength that should inspire us all. Their wedding night fears were justified, and their courage in facing them reminds us that even in history's darkest chapters, the human spirit finds ways to endure.